I do think this new technology is a very interesting, and whomever she was, Satoshi Nakamoto, it's led to change. It's pushing at the side of central banks around the globe to reconsider how to provide payment systems. It's pushing on the side as a catalyst for change in finance, so-called fintech, the intersection of new technologies in finance. I taught this and studied it for several years at MIT, and really wouldn't have dedicated my time to it if I didn't think it was interesting and innovative. But at the same time, I don't think technologies long last outside of a social and public policy framework. And in this case, we have to ensure for investor and consumer protection. That's what an agency like ours, the SEC, does, but also ensure other public policy goals, that people are compliant with taxes and compliant with what's called anti-money laundering and the like, and that we don't undermine the stability of the system. So I think it's better to bring it inside the public policy framework and ensure that we address these important public policy goals. But I'm sorry I interrupted you about this strong words that you were saying I had said.
No, that's not a bad phrase in my book. So let's get into the details of this. In your testimony, you said if we don't address these issues with cryptocurrencies, I worry a lot of people will get hurt. You said in your testimony last week that the SEC already has authority it needs to regulate crypto, but then, as I read your testimony, you also talked about wanting more authority to do that more properly. So tell us what you can do now with the authority you have and what you'd like to do additionally in areas that you're not now able to regulate.
So the SEC stood up in the 1930s, got a very broad remit to cover securities, and Congress decided to write this definition broadly, included 30 or 35 subparts to it.
So just to play devil's advocate on this for a moment, the appeal of these new instruments of cryptocurrencies is precisely that they're not mediated by banks, by existing financial institutions, and that they're outside of traditional regulation. That's part of why they've arisen. And the question is whether, if you institute the kind of regime you're talking about, that wouldn't just accelerate the push of these instruments into other jurisdictions, other unregulated areas. It's almost like a reverse arms race. People would find new ways to escape your scrutiny. Are you worried about that?
David, new technologies come along. The internet came along, and we all saw it popularized in the 1990s. And the question, well, how is that going to fit within our public policy goals and framework? Do we tax commerce on the internet? What about speech on the internet? And we had to sort through these things. So new technology is generally a good thing. It challenges the establishment. But I don't think that new technologies really long exist outside of public policy frameworks. Congress can come together and change it. They could say, look, leave it out. We Congress don't mind if people are defrauded. We don't mind if people manipulate markets. I don't think that's what Congress is going to say, though. And that's what is all too often happening. This is a field, I've said it publicly, it's rife with fraud and abuse and hucksters and the like. And it is, as you said, a global market, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are innovations that are challenging finance. And that's a really exciting thing. It's why I studied it so closely at MIT. But I would also say that if it's going to take off at all inside a public policy framework, and think about it, those projects, those 5,000 or 6,000 projects, are raising money from the public. What else is an investment if it's not raising money from the public, anticipating profit, and the public is hoping for a better retirement or a better vacation next year if they make some money on this crypto or that crypto? I'd lastly say we've experimented historically with private forms of money. In the U.S., those of you listening might even remember something called the wildcat banking era, and it is from the 1830s to the 1860s. After President Jackson got rid of the second bank of the U.S. Sorry for the history lesson, but we had banks issuing banknotes, and they competed. Philadelphia banknotes were different than Baltimore banknotes, and even within Philadelphia had different banknotes competing and the like. Well, that all had a lot of costs, a lot of problems, and so forth. And Abraham Lincoln put in place an oversight called the Comptroller of the Currency, and then the Federal Reserve came 50 years later. And so public money has certain place around the globe. Private monies usually don't last that long. So I don't think there's a long-term viability for 5,000 or 6,000 private forms of money. History tells us otherwise. So in the meantime, I think it's worthwhile to have an investor protection regime placed around this.
Let me ask you about one interesting new development in this area of regulation. The Wall Street Journal reported today that big U.S. and European banks had told the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, which is one of the major global oversight bodies that protects against financial risk, that setting standards for regulation that would have strict capital requirements for Bitcoin was something that they would oppose. And I'm curious whether you've had a chance to look at that, whether you'd be in agreement with the position the banks took, or whether you'd want to push back on that.
David, I have not taken a close look at that, so I don't know. I mean, holding a highly volatile asset, Bitcoin is that. It's a digital, scarce, I would even say speculative store of value. To hold appropriate capital, if it's on a bank's balance sheet, would seem to fit into the remit that we've had in the past, that there'd be appropriate shock absorbers against the potential loss, but I haven't seen that specific release.
Final quick question about crypto, and then I want to turn to another subject at the end. Basic question is, if these cryptocurrencies, tokens, were subject to regulation, investor protection, is this basic process of money outside of banks and mediation good for the United States? Is this an aspect of financial development, financial engineering that over the long run will be beneficial for us as an economy, beneficial for investors, or does it give you basic worries?
So, and I've said this in the classroom, and I've said it to my colleagues around the globe in the official sector. I think it's been a catalyst for change. Nakamoto-san's innovation, not only Bitcoin as the first sort of one, but this whole distributed ledger technology has been a catalyst for change. That around the globe, central banks and the private sector are looking at how we can enhance our payment systems, and enhancing our payment systems to make them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, real time at lower cost. And so there's some competition right now going on there. I also think it's raising new and interesting innovations around how exchanges work, and how even potentially some forms of decentralized lending. We've had peer-to-peer lending for 15, 20 years. We've experimented with it. This is a new type of experiment. So those, I think, are really interesting innovations challenging the established business models. On the other hand, I would say I don't think it's a good idea to wait until there's a spill in aisle 3 and we hear in the loudspeakers overhead from the Washington Post and your competitors, clean up in aisle 3, and then those of us in the official sector have to rush in, and we've got congressional hearings, and we're sort of like, well, why wasn't anybody worried there was going to be a need for clean up in aisle 3. And I think at $2 trillion, 5 or 6,000 projects, that it would be better to be inside investor, consumer protection, inside the tax compliance and anti-money laundering and financial stability. Now, if we don't do anything and there's never a spill in aisle 3, great. But I think history tells us private forms of money don't last long. History tells us that investment contracts outside an investment protection remit, people get hurt. That if we have lending platforms that are outside either the securities perimeter or banking perimeter, that usually they get excess leverage and we have financial stability issues. These stable coins are acting almost like poker chips at the casino right now. So add to the Wild West analogy. I mean, we've got a lot of casinos here in the Wild West, and the poker chip is these stable coins, at the casino gaming tables. And so I think there's just a lot of kind of warning signs and flashing lights that we might have a spill in aisle 3, and I'd rather get ahead of it.